Okay, Delbert Dutch Rohlinger. And my career on the Milwaukee Railroad was I hired out on the Milwaukee at the age of 19 in 1949, February the 3rd. Became an engineer on the Milwaukee in July 19th, 1950. And worked there for over 30 years. My grandfather ran the railroad before the railroad built there in 1908. And then he finally went to work on the section, not the section, but the Carmen. My other grandfather worked on the section. And then as far as my career goes, was from 1949 to 1980 when the railroad shut down. And I was a fireman. Up until 1960, I was promoted to engineer, and so I was an engineer on the Milwaukee until the railroad shut down in 1980.
What did being a fireman? What did that entail?
Steam days. Started out on steam engines, and then that's how I first got the job, as watch steam engines in the roundhouse. And so I asked him if there'd be a chance of going to work as a fireman, and he called the office and they said no, you had to be 21. And the roundhouse foreman in Spokane was my father's foreman at Avery, roundhouse foreman at Avery, so I knew him and his whole family. But yeah, so it was just steam engine days until the diesels came about, and then so they kind of kept me busy in the winter when they had to have somebody watch steam engines in the winter. So when I wasn't firing, I'd be still working in the roundhouse. But so that worked out pretty good until I finally got a job and the diesels came about, and I'd be guessing about 1953. They had the booster engines, and so it might have been a good thing if they would have had all one kind of power rather than two different types of power. When they finally come along and got the booster locomotives, well then what wound up, well, they needed an engine for some other job, and so these certain engines were married to each other, so they steal one from there to use it over there, and then when they needed it over here, they didn't have it. So they didn't have another unit for them, So that would be one drawback for the railroad, as far as the railroad goes, But all the rest of it is fine as far as I'm concerned. It's too bad that they had to close down, but I don't know. It's the way it goes with business sometimes, I guess.
What were some of the difficulties?
Well, I don't know. All hours of the day and night going to work is kind of a difficulty. Everybody would tell you that, I suppose. But so I don't know. Other than that,
Well, it was pretty dangerous, right?
well, you don't think about it when you're working. I don't know. I never thought it was so dangerous. But one time I went into Avery, and that's where the trolley began, about 50 car lengths west of the West Switch at Avery. And I come around there with the diesels, and trolley line had dropped down far enough that it hooked on the horn of the diesel. So we tore down about 50 car lengths of wire and 3 telephone poles. So that was a little exciting. It lit up the whole canyon as a fire was going around every wheel on every car, and we had some auto racks on the head end. It's like a welder going, And so finally we got stopped, and called the depot and told them to cut the power down there, and we never got off the engine until the electricians come down and said it was safe to get off, or the trolley crew. So they came down and said it was okay to get off, and the trolley foreman says, well, I didn't know the wire went this far. I don't think they'd ever been down there to check it. But yeah, that was part of it. But that was a little exciting. And so I don't know, that's about the most exciting thing I had working on the Milwaukee, I guess. And I guess there's a lot of different things that happen, snow slides and things like that. Yeah.
The winter's tough?
Pardon?
Were the winters tough?
Yeah, they're tough up at Avery, pretty tough. Of course, when I was a child, I lived in Othello until I was 10, then I moved to Avery. My dad was a Boilermaker helper, and so we wound up moving to Avery in 1940, and then my father passed away in 1945. But yeah, the winters up there, I thought were fine for raising a son, but they were long. I don't know if you've ever been to Avery, but it's right in a canyon, and the sun would come down so far you could see it on the hill, and then it'd go back up the hill. You never would see it down there. all winter long, you know. But, so I don't know, that's the way it was. It rained quite a bit there. I used to deliver papers up there when I was a kid. And then you have to walk from one end of town to the other. It's about, well, I guess it'd be about 2 miles going clear from east end clear to the west end, then come back and go to school. Be sopping wet, you know. So,
Do you get pretty close with all the guys you worked with? Oh, good, pretty good.
yeah,
friends?
you know, when you retire, well, like I put in almost 43 years, and when you retire, yeah, you know you're going to do that, or I did anyway. You miss the camaraderie with all the people that you work with. I don't care what job you're on, you'll probably do that. You know, you'll miss the camaraderie with the people. As far as the actual work, I never missed any of the work. Of course, I live close by the BN tracks up there, so I hear them blowing for the crossings all the time anyway, but which doesn't bother me at all. But it's changed a lot since I retired. I've been retired over 20 years, and so yeah, it's changed quite a lot. They tell me anyway, and the power's changed, and of course it was changing while I was working too. And then, well, I worked on Milwaukee until Milwaukee shut down in 1980, and I got hired by the Western Pacific out of Seattle. They had us come to Seattle. The Railroad Retirement Board said they were going to have somebody come to Spokane. I said, why would I want to go to Seattle? And then there's other two guys and I got to talking, and they said, well, they're going to go over to Seattle. I said, well, why would you want to go to Seattle when they're going to interview people here in Spokane? Well, come to find out, they never did interview anybody in Spokane. So the three of us chipped in together, and we drove over there, and out of the three of us, I was the only one that got hired on the Western Pacific. So I went to work in the Western Pacific Railroad in 1980, and then they worked us like 49 days and laid us all off. So that was in April, shortly after the railroad shut down, and then in August they called us all back, and they didn't call us all. They only called 12 out of the 22 that they originally hired. So they were very fair. They took us in our seniority order off of the Milwaukee. So whatever your seniority was on the Milwaukee, that's what you had down there. You weren't ahead of any of their people, which I never expected to be ahead of them. You know, nobody would want to do that. So anyway, they were all. So there was, well, let's see, there was Rohlinger, Ollinger, and Olin. When we went to Portola, California, and the agent down there, or a crew caller, he says, no, it's not that anymore. It's 1, 2, and 3. So that's the way we went by down there. So, and they were very fair that if we couldn't be an engineer down there, they'd have us be a fireman. They had what they called a no furlough clause. So they couldn't lay you off. Once you establish your date, they could never lay you off. So you'd either be a fireman or you'd be an engineer. So that worked out pretty good for us. I thought it was very, otherwise I could have never made it. Nobody could have ever made it. Like paying for your house in Spokane, and then renting a place down there, and then, you know, so it just wouldn't have ever worked out. If you got laid off, you'd be out of a job and no money coming in. Well, then about that time, they established a guaranteed engineers extra board. So naturally, not all of them, but quite a few senior engineers would go on the guaranteed engineers extra board because they knew they were going to get paid so much. Then that gave it opening for us to be an engineer, you know. So, but anytime and I worked all the way from Stockton, California to Salt Lake City, and not all in one run, of course, but I worked out of Portola, I worked out of Winnemucca, Nevada, I worked out of Elko, Nevada, and I worked out of Salt Lake City in my period of career. And my wife lived in Portola all the time. Say one thing for the Union Pacific, they give you pretty good power most of the time. And I didn't have too much trouble with the Western Pacific, but then when the UP merged, they took all their units and they were all in one yard. I got a picture of them someplace at home, and they just sent them all back east and scrapped them, I guess, or whatever. Sold them to different railroads, changed the paint on them and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the Union Pacific is pretty darn good, I thought. They're a very progressive railroad. And as long as you've done your job, well, didn't have any trouble at all. Western Pacific was a kind of a small railroad too, you know. They only had 900 miles of track, period. And here, they'd always say, how come the Milwaukee went bankrupt? And I said, well, they had 10,000 miles of track. Why would I think they're going to go bankrupt, you know? Here, you only got 900 miles of track from San Francisco to Salt Lake City. and they stayed alive, and Milwaukee folded. So, so anyway, that's about the way that's gone. So.